There's no doubt that we're living in strange times. Barely a day goes by without something inexplicable being thrust in front of our eyes. But perhaps we can take solace in the fact that history is filled with such events, from the groundbreaking to the bizarre. In this compilation, we'll be exploring just a few of those occasions. We begin with a story that shows that Monty Python films are more educational than you may think. Cinemagoers in 1975 who ventured in to see the first feature film produced by Monty Python's Flying Circus, entitled Monty Python and the Holy Grail, would have seen many intentionally ludicrous scenes. King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, for instance, didn't have any horses and instead rode around knocking coconut shells together to make it sound like they were galloping. Another sketch provides a take on the absurdity of the witch hunts in medieval times.
What makes you think she is a witch?
Well, she turned me into a newt.
A newt?
I got better.
But amongst the most iconic scenes is surely that involving the killer rabbit of Kaspar, a fairly small white rabbit that kills 3 of the knights and injures several others, causing King Arthur to order his men to retreat in its wake. Only after calling upon the powers of the Holy Hand Grenade of Antioch are Arthur and his knights able to defeat the malevolent bunny rabbit. Now, of course, that seems like an absurd scenario. However, many medieval scholars have since pointed out that the ever-highbrow Pythons were sprinkling in some very clever literary references here. You see, the killer rabbit of Kaspar was based on a strange feature of numerous famous illuminated manuscripts of the late medieval era, ones which often portray killer rabbits vividly in the marginal illustrations. A good place to start when it comes to assessing these medieval killer rabbits is the Smithfield Decretals. The Smithfield Decretals is an illuminated manuscript held in the British Library in London. These types of manuscripts got their name from the fact that their pages were illuminated by decorating them with colourful illustrations of one type or another. At its most basic, this might involve making the first letter in the first word on the page a very large size and illustrating it ornately with different coloured inks. More often than not, an illuminated manuscript will also include colourful drawings in the margins or in specifically allocated sections of the pages. As a result, these manuscripts are one of the great art forms of medieval Europe. The Smithfield Decretals are one of many thousands of illuminated manuscripts extant today. What's especially peculiar about the appearance of drawings of killer rabbits in this manuscript is that the subject matter of the book was otherwise quite serious. The Smithfield Decretals are a copy of the Decretals of Pope Gregory XI. These were drawn up in the 1230s on the orders of Pope Gregory by St. Raymond of Peñafort, a Dominican cleric, and comprise an updated anthology of church or canon law. The Smithfield Decretals, a volume containing over 300 pages of Gregory's decretals, were actually compiled by a cleric named John Betail in southern France in the early 14th century. The volume was taken to England not long afterwards and ended up at the religious priory of St. Bartholomew at Smithfield in London, thus acquiring the name. It was probably here that the illustrations were incorporated into the volume. Today, it is housed in the British Library in London. They ended up here in part because of the unique nature of the illustrations on the manuscript. Throughout these pages, lethal leopards parade around on their 2 hind legs, behaving like humans. In fact, they are often chasing and hunting human prey. In one scene, for instance, we see a figure desperately fleeing from a tall rabbit that stands, preparing to unleash an arrow from a bow. In another illustration, one is holding a man close to its chest, while a second rabbit sinisterly prepares to bludgeon him with a mace. Elsewhere, a man is being decapitated by a rabbit wielding a long sword, while in yet another scene, two bunnies are dragging a naked man who is tied up with some rope up a hill towards a gallows where they are clearly going to hang him. The scenes continue throughout the book. One even involves a man being held between two rabbits while a third sits before them as though it is a judge adjudicating on the man's fate. It's all quite jarring in its own way, not just because we're seeing scene after scene of killer rabbits running amok, but because there is such a strange contrast between the pictures and the actual text of the manuscript. A question quickly emerges. Why on earth are there images of horrible hares and raucous rabbits all over a manuscript primarily concerned with medieval canon or church law? Strangely enough, the images of the killer rabbits in the margins of the Smithfield decretals are not that unusual. There are a more robust example of the form, but it was quite common for medieval illuminated manuscripts to be decorated in the margins and other blank spaces by bizarre scenes of animals, trees, humans, and nature. And maybe even Yoda, apparently. These satirical images are known as drolleries, on account of their often humorous or absurd nature. The word derives from the French term drôlerie, meaning a joke. Drolleries are small images of any kind which might be included in a manuscript in this way, sort of a medieval meme. Often they focused on the idea of the world being turned upside down or the natural order of things being inverted. So, the Smithfield decretals are a classic example, one which shows a world in which killer rabbits have taken on the guise of the hunters, while humans have become the hunted. Animals were a common feature of such drolleries. For instance, in the Galston Psalter, another late medieval illuminated manuscript in the British Library, we see images of animals engaged in unusual activities. In another, known as the Macclesfield Psalter, which was produced right around the same time as the Smithfield decretals in the 14th century, giant skates and other fish and mammals terrorise humans. Thus, there is no shortage of examples of drolleries in later medieval manuscripts, and the killer rabbits of the Smithfield decretals fit within an established tradition of amusing marginalia that sits alongside much more sombre religious texts. Other examples of things which might be included as drolleries are the signs of the zodiac, or things which symbolise the passage of the seasons or other elements of the calendar. For instance, it is not uncommon to find pictures showing how medieval peasants lived around the vagaries of the annual harvest. Others could involve references to ancient cultures and mythology. There are many other illuminated manuscripts that have drolleries featuring either killer rabbits or other animals engaged in quite spectacular behaviour. Perhaps the earliest example comes from the 1170s, a century and a half prior to when the Smithfield decretals were produced. This is found in the Arnstein Pastorale, which is catalogued as Harley Manuscript 2801 in the British Library today. Here, the letter T at the beginning of a passage has been elaborately decorated to show two rabbits hanging a man from the top of the T, which, in this instance, has been turned into a gallows or gibbet. In another manuscript that was produced in France in the early 14th century, we see images where the world has truly been turned upside down. This is in the Breviary or liturgical book of Renaud de Bar. Here, the rabbits are depicted as knights jousting with one another, while some unfortunate humans have been turned into horses of a kind. One is depicted, for instance, as a half-man, half-snail figure with a rabbit astride his back, charging at another rabbit. There are hundreds of richly decorated, illuminated manuscripts from the period between the 11th and 15th centuries, which show animals of all shapes and sizes engaged in peculiar behaviour. A slightly less comedic but richly decorated example is the Aberdeen Bestiary, a volume produced around the year 1200 in Scotland, which King Henry VIII of England acquired over 3 centuries later. Here, animals of various kinds appear on nearly every page, some being mythical creatures like griffins or phoenixes. Trees and other aspects of nature are also presented in peculiar and ornate ways. What all of this points toward is a society that had a very different impression of nature. Today we view nature as something we have conquered and gained mastery over, and instead need to try and preserve as much as possible. However, to people of the Middle Ages who lived with the constant threat of famine and violence, one in which a wolf attacking a village's sheep or rabbits laying waste to a field of crops overnight could make the local food supply precarious for weeks or months to come. Such images of wild and violent animals reflected psychological concerns about how precarious their own place in the world was. This was a society that had not managed to gain mastery over nature yet, and their anxieties about this manifested themselves in peculiar ways in the margins of their manuscripts. While some took this very seriously, others took a more wry stance and created medieval memes that would circuitously end up in a Monty Python film. Our next story explores the strange tale of a boy found wandering the streets of Nuremberg. But was the story he told true, or just a fabrication? On May the 26th, 1828, a teenage boy wandered into the public square in Nuremberg, Germany. It would not have been an event to draw much attention, save for his unusual tattered clothing, lurching walk, and the letters he clasped in his hand. One was addressed to the captain of the 4th Squadron of the 6th Cavalry Regiment, Captain von Wessenig. That was enough to get the young man, who said his name was Kaspar Hauser, led to the captain by a kindly shoemaker. Upon meeting the captain, Hauser could only repeat, "I want to be a cavalryman, as my father was, and horse, horse." The boy answered all questions with "don't know." Wessenig's concerns were not eased by the letter the dishevelled lad had brought him either. The missive was written by a labourer who claimed the boy had been left in his care on October the 7th, 1812, with the instructions to teach him reading, writing, and the Christian religion in close confinement. According to Hauser's caretaker, the time had come to allow the boy to leave and start a military career. The letter finished with the author explaining it would cost me my neck to escort Hauser to the city himself. Deeply troubled by both the contents of the letter and the perplexing young man in front of him, Wessenig took both to the local police. Hauser's second letter, apparently written by his mother to his caretaker, claimed that her son had been born on April the 30th, 1812, and that the boy's father had died and she could not care for him. She wished him to become a horseman like his father. By all accounts, it appeared as if the boy had been abandoned by his mother to the care of an unknown keeper. Police noted that Hauser behaved as if he were a child, walking in toddler's short, unsure steps, as if he were just learning what his feet and legs were capable of. But he was of sound mind, and though he didn't speak freely, he could parrot words and phrases, leaving officials confident he was not, as they so eloquently put it, an idiot. Hauser had a small vocabulary, consisting mainly of words referring to horses. Though bruised from his journey to town, his feet were as soft as the palm of a hand, as though he had never before walked in shoes. Unsure what else to do, the police detained Hauser as a vagrant. For the next 2 months, the boy was visited by many who sought to unravel the mystery of his origins. The mayor claimed he was making progress, but few agreed. Kaspar could not share anything but his name and refused all food and drink except bread and water. He appeared repulsed by meat and vegetables and ate wildly with no evidence of manners. When he was brought a lighted candle, he stared in amazement at the tiny flame before reaching to grab it and burning his hand. Similarly, he was bewildered by his reflection in a mirror, repeatedly trying to touch the figure in the glass. It seemed clear to the authorities that Hauser must have been feral for most of his life and had raised himself. Sure now that no parent would come forward to claim the strange child, he was made a ward of the city and taken into the custody of Friedrich Daumer, a schoolmaster, poet and philosopher who taught him how to read and write. Hauser also revealed a talent for drawing and sketching elaborate images. As his trust and mind expanded, he shared more about his life before appearing in Nuremberg. The boy claimed that for as long as he remembered, he had lived entirely alone in a darkened cell with only a straw bed and 3 carved wooden toys. Hauser said he awoke each morning to rye bread and water beside his bed, which sometimes tasted bitter and caused him to fall into a deep sleep. Following these slumbers, Kaspar claimed he would discover his straw had been changed and his hair and nails cut. Shortly before his release, a man came to visit him, never revealing his face. The man taught him to write his name, walk, and say a few phrases. His tale of cruel solitary confinement gained international attention amid rumours that the boy was of royal heritage. Others claim he was a clever impostor seeking fame and fortune. Both stories were fed further by the events of October 17, 1829, when the youth was found in the cellar of Daumer's home, bleeding from a wound on his forehead. Hauser claimed he had been attacked in the privy by a hooded man who threatened him, "You still have to die, ere you leave the city of Nuremberg." The voice, Hauser claimed, belonged to the man who had brought him to the outskirts of the city. Following the trail of blood, officials were able to ascertain that Hauser had at first fled to his room on the first floor, then gone downstairs and climbed through a trap door into the cellar. That he had not sought aid from his caretaker alarmed police, and they transferred him to the care of a municipal authority. Those who believed Hauser to be of noble blood claimed the attack as proof someone in power was seeking to keep him quiet. Those who thought the boy a clever impostor purported he had inflicted the wound upon himself, dumped the weapon in his room, and then hid in the cellar. Now living with a local authority, Kaspar was still not free from strange injuries. On April the 3rd, 1830, a pistol shot sounded in the young man's room, and he was found bleeding from a wound on the right side of his head. Once recovered, he claimed that he had climbed up on a chair to get some books when the chair slipped beneath him. Trying to find a handhold, Hauser accidentally grabbed a pistol hanging on the wall, but some did not buy this story. The pistol accident happened shortly after an argument with his new caretaker, who accused the boy of lying. Eerily, this report matched one given by Daumer, who had also claimed to have charged Hauser of being untruthful with him just before he was attacked by the hooded stranger. But there were still plenty of interested parties who believed Hauser to be either a secret prince or at worst a traumatized young man who had been a victim of abuse his entire young life. One such supporter was Lord Stanhope, a British nobleman who gained custody of Hauser in 1831. Planning to take the boy with him upon his return to England. He was deeply invested in the boy's background and spent considerable time and money trying to prove his origins. He even took Hauser twice to Hungary after the young man seemed to remember some Hungarian words and had once said he thought the Hungarian Countess Maitheny had been his mother, following a dream about being in the company of an elaborately dressed woman in an enormous castle. But the boy didn't recognize anything familiar on his trips to Hungary, and the complete failure of the expeditions left Stanhope unsure of his ward's legitimacy. Frustrated and feeling deceived, Stanhope sent Hauser to Ansbach under the care of a schoolmaster named Meyer. Though Stanhope continued to pay for Kaspar's living expenses, he never returned for his charge and returned to England alone. Under Meyer's care, Hauser again met disapproval. The schoolmaster found the young man deceitful and untrustworthy and sent him to work as a copyist in a local law office. He began to grow depressed and despondent when he realized that Stanhope was not returning for him. He and Meyer quarreled about the topic, and several days later, Hauser burst into the schoolmaster's home with a deep wound in his left breast. He claimed he had been stabbed by a stranger who had lured him to a park. He attempted to lead Meyer to the spot, but collapsed along the way. Unlike his previous injuries, this one would prove fatal, with Hauser passing away amid incoherent babbling about writing and a purse. Local authorities found a purse and penciled note written in mirror writing at the spot the boy claimed to have been stabbed. But many were still unconvinced the fatal wound had been dealt by anyone other than Hauser himself. The note read, "Hauser will be able to tell you quite precisely how I look and from where I am. To save Hauser the effort, I want to tell you myself from where I come. I come from the Bavarian border, on the river. I will even tell you the name, M-L-O. It contained spelling and grammatical errors Hauser himself often made and was folded in a triangle, the same way Meyer claimed his ward was fond of. Kaspar Hauser was buried in the city cemetery in Ansbach with a headstone that read, 'Here lies Kaspar Hauser, riddle of his time. His birth was unknown, his death mysterious, 1833. And though Kaspar himself had been laid to rest, theories about him were not. A medical practitioner present at his autopsy reported abnormalities in the brain that some would later claim were indicative of epilepsy. Other forensic examiners claimed the wound could have easily been self-inflicted, which led to rumours that it was a possible bid to renew interest in his story or convince Stanhope to take him to England as promised. As to his origins, there were plenty of theories that gained traction. One of the most popular was that Kaspar Hauser was the hereditary Prince of Baden, who had been born in September of 1812 and died just a month later. Supporters of the Baden theory claim that the prince had been switched with another infant who died, while the actual prince emerged 16 years later in the form of Kaspar Hauser. If that were true, Hauser's birth parents were Charles, Grand Duke of Baden, and Stephanie de Beauharnais, adopted daughter and cousin by marriage of Napoleon. Theorists propose that the Countess of Hochberg kidnapped the infant prince in fear he could challenge the succession of her son, Leopold. Hauser's murder, they claimed, was an effort to suppress his true identity. This theory was refuted through official documents presented in the 1870s, including proof of the prince's emergency baptism, autopsy, burial, and letters from the Grand Duke's mother. She gave detailed accounts of being present throughout the entirety of the child's birth, illness, and death. The DNA analysis conducted in the late 1990s, yes, the theory persisted that long, finally proved once and for all that bloodstains from Kaspar's clothing did not match that of any living maternal relatives of Stephanie de Beauharnais. Kaspar Hauser was not the Prince of Baden. Was he perhaps then a dedicated and clever swindler? Many think so. Supporters of this theory point to the evidence that the letters Hauser carried into Nuremberg and the mirror note found in the park where he was stabbed were all reported to match his own handwriting. Then there was the suspicious way in which Hauser continued to seem to fall victim to accidents and injuries immediately following arguments about the integrity of his story. Others point to how quickly he was able to learn to speak, write and socialise for a man who supposedly lived his life entirely in solitary confinement. Other feral children have never replicated such a remarkable feat. Similarly, Kaspar suffered none of the physical ailments seen in others who have endured such conditions. His skin was not noticeably pale. He did not have rickets from a lack of vitamin D, and he seemed, from the very start, far more mentally stable than one would expect of a child raised in total isolation. The mystery of Kaspar Hauser inspired works from author Herman Melville, poet Paul Verlaine, playwright Peter Handke, and dozens of others. In 1974, German filmmaker Werner Herzog turned Kaspar's story into a feature film, The Enigma of Kaspar Hauser. His story even gave name to an experiment in which a non-human animal is reared in isolation from members of its own species to determine innate behaviours. If Kaspar's tale of severe neglect is accurate, his story is one of great tragedy and cruelty inflicted by nearly every caretaker he knew in his short life. If, more likely, his tale is one of carefully crafted cunning to become famous, it worked better than Kaspar Hauser could ever have imagined. The appearance of another strange visitor is at the centre of our next story. But this fellow was said to be a tad more demonic. Devon, situated in the southwest corner of England, is known for its rugged beauty. Its two coastlines, one bordering the English Channel to the south and another bordering the Irish Sea and Bristol Channel in the north, are home to dramatic towering cliffs and long miles of beaches. The county's interior is dominated by rolling fields, tracts of heath and green moors. While the Devon of today is a haven for tourists, the Devon of 1855 was one of farmers eking out a living, a declining mining industry and craggy isolation. Life in rural Devonshire revolved around the never-ending struggle to feed your family and the respite of faith, religion and superstition. Because of its stagnant agricultural population and the isolated nature of the district, Devon clung to customs and superstitions that had been largely phased out in other parts of the country. A 19th century volume on folklore outlined a few of the more interesting beliefs. A case of boils can be cured by walking around a freshly dug grave 6 times, then crawling across it 3 times. Beekeepers must inform their hives of news of the household to keep their colonies happy. The doors and windows of the house must be set open when a funeral procession leaves and a shoe is thrown after a new bride for luck. The people of Devonshire were accustomed to moving through their day with an eye trained toward omens and indications of luck, good or bad. So when they discovered the cloven prints upon the snow that fateful February day, the impact was instantaneous and profound. The winter of 1855 was unusually cold in the south of England. The temperatures remained around freezing well into the new year, and many rivers were frozen. Slushy snow never thawed, creating a crunchy ground covering as temperatures dropped in the night. The unusual weather pattern made folks uneasy. Nearly everyone relied on predictable temperatures and precipitation to make a living. The beginning of February was marked by heavy snowfall, a rarity in a place that usually only sees a few light snow showers each year. On the night of February the 8th, the weather was particularly foul. Heavy snow gave way to freezing rain and wild winds. In the morning, a hard frost cemented the ground, freezing in place the evidence of each footfall upon the snow. At 6 o'clock, a baker named Henry Pilk emerged from his bakehouse in the small town of Topsham to admire the effect of the sparkling landscape. He noticed a line of peculiar prints in the snow. Each print resembled a small horseshoe, roughly the size of a donkey's hoof. But unlike a donkey, pony, or other pack animal, the prints were not in the staggered gait of a four-footed beast. Instead, they formed two straight lines, as if whatever creature had left them walked upon 2 feet, not 4. The strangest part, though, was that the prints started at the wooden fence, approached the side of the bakehouse, and then turned again back toward the fence. Henry Pilk spent a few minutes pondering the strange tracks, then returned to his bakehouse and became absorbed in the busy morning work of a baker. An hour later, Mr. Pilk's yard was flooded by a group of local men, including Albert Brailford, the local schoolmaster. The group had followed a set of strange tracks from the road to Henry Pilk's yard. In fact, the same hoof marks were visible outside nearly every house in the street, in several adjoining streets, and in the fields beyond. Most perplexing of all, the tracks seemed to follow a path no man or beast could feasibly walk. Some of the tracks led into gardens surrounded by 12-foot stone walls. Sometimes the tracks jumped up onto roofs, over snow-covered wagons, and through fences. The tracks never faltered or doubled back. They simply continued on to the other side of the obstacle, as if whatever had left them had the ability to walk through walls and jump enormous distances. The people of Topsham soon discovered that they were not the only ones visited by the mysterious track lever. The trail led across towns, villages, and lonely farmsteads between Topsham and Totnes, spanning nearly 100 miles. In Mamhead, a farmer followed the print across an open field and up to an 18-foot-high haystack covered in snow. The haystack itself was unmarked, with no prints leading around it, but the tracks continued on the other side. At the Exe River estuary, the trail led up to the western bank and continued on the opposite shore, seeming to have jumped across the wide expanse of water without faltering. In Lympstone, every garden in the village had been visited, as though whatever had left the tracks had peered into the windows of each home. Each print measured about 3 to 4 inches long and about 2 inches across. The steps were smaller than an animal's gait, about 8 to 16 inches apart in a single file. The creature's legs appeared to be about 6 inches apart. By mid-afternoon, the women and children in Devon were locked snugly inside their homes. The landscape swarmed with men and dogs armed for hunting, though they knew not what creature they sought. Some of the men believed they'd find a farm beast the size of a donkey. Others thought it was possible they were hunting the devil himself. For who else would walk upon 2 cloven feet and have the ability to jump onto roofs and walk through walls? The superstitious feared that Satan had visited the Devonshire countryside, marking out possible victims for future nefarious plans. But the prints had largely faded by evening, and the hunters were left bewildered. Though no beast had been found, the rumours around the mystery grew increasingly outlandish. Folks swore they'd seen the hoof marks glow like live coals in one town. In another, farmers said they'd heard devilish laughter echoing through lonely glades. The educated, staunchly unsuperstitious, laughed at these claims, certain that the Prince of Darkness was not responsible for the cloven prints. But they offered no alternative explanation, and a ghostly feeling of dread settled across the moors and glens of Devonshire. The Exeter and Plymouth Gazette published a letter from a Devon man outlining the strange incident. It read, in part, "The creature seems to have advanced to the doors of several houses and then to have retraced its steps, but no one is able to discern the starting or resting point of this mysterious visitor. Everyone is wondering, but no one is able to explain the mystery. The poor are full of superstition and consider it little short of a visit from old Satan or some of his imps. Truman's Exeter Flying Post published a piece on the footprints and called it an excitement worthy of the Dark Ages. The Illustrated London News included drawings of the tracks collected from several Devon residents, sparking months of suggestions from readers on what may have left the strange prints. Letters to the paper from zoologists and naturalists speculated that the prints had been made by the hind foot of a badger or a great bustard. Others suggested it may have been an errant otter or a high-hopping frog. One writer said the footmarks described by your Devon correspondent are made, in my opinion, by the poor, despised and insignificant rat. Another claimed the tracks were those of a unipede or uniped, a rarely sighted bird that had apparently been spotted by the Icelandic explorer Björn Hjörleifsson in Labrador in the year 1011. In his description, Björn states the bird had a single leg with a hoof-like foot, and instead of flying, it is said to have hopped long distances. But with no evidence remaining to be examined firsthand, the mysterious nighttime visitor remained unnamed. Many believed the marks could be the work of a mischievous prankster, perhaps wearing specially designed shoes to leave the perplexing prints. This suspicion was not without merit. The Victorian era was surprisingly rife with pranks. In 1839, the Baltimore Sun published a story about a prankster filling a pepper mill with gunpowder to surprise Sam, his unsuspecting cook. The prankster wrote, "Boiler blown up, scalding cat and 3 kittens, who jumped about, giving fine specimens of animal magnetism. Sam, with a live coal in his eye, dancing about, blind with rage, cleared the shelves of crockery with his toasting fork and, coming to anchor in a large block tin dish cover, sat down to swear. Never laughed so much in my life." In 1862, the Reading Times reported that a reader paid the town watchman to rap on his door and shout "fire." The reader's wife ran into the street naked. A group of women in New Orleans concocted a passionate love letter asking that the receiver meet the writer with a white rosette in his buttonhole under the post office clock. The next evening, 52 young men with white rosettes assembled under the clock at 8 p.m. Not all pranks were harmless, however. I think we covered that with that lunatic and the pepper mill. In 1883, a railroad engineer in Colorado nearly caused an accident when he braked suddenly to avoid hitting what he believed was a man on the railroad tracks. It turned out to be an April Fool's prank. In 1896, a man in Wichita, Kansas, disguised himself as a tramp to frighten his wife. The woman fainted and died an hour later. It seemed entirely possible that someone had taken advantage of a snowy night to lead their neighbours on a ceaseless hunt for an imaginary creature. At once, people were imagining what lengths the prankster had gone to in creating the trail of prints. Perhaps a wheel with hoofs affixed at 8-inch intervals that could be trundled along the ground. Or maybe a printmaker that fitted over the hoaxer's own shoes. But technical impossibilities stumped the theorists. A hoaxer would have only about 6 hours of darkness to execute the prank, which stretched for nearly 100 miles, meaning he'd need to be moving at a rate of over 16 miles per hour. And it still didn't explain how the tracks managed to jump walls and onto roofs. Plus, no one could think of a likely candidate for such a prank. Who would want to spend one of the coldest, wettest nights of the year trampling through the countryside, leaving tracks that might very well be gone before morning? Reverend Musgrave of Mamhead sent sketches of the marks to the British Museum, the Zoological Society and the director of Regent's Park Menagerie in London. Musgrave also wrote to the London Illustrated News about his personal theory for the tracks. He believed they belonged to a kangaroo, which had escaped from some circus or animal show travelling through Devon. But while a kangaroo does hop on two legs, it keeps its legs parallel, leaving a distinct double trail. Plus, there was no real similarity between the hoof prints in Devon and that of a kangaroo. Other preachers were less interested in possible animal theories. Many Devonshire clergymen used the prints to great effect in their sermons, hinting at ominous signs in our midst to encourage their parishioners to correct their immoralities. For weeks, locals who'd encountered the prints or even just heard of them in passing moved with fear. They avoided the areas where the prints had been spotted, calling them Devil's Walks. Farmers often armed themselves when they went into their fields, and people began scanning the ground carefully each morning on alert for new tracks. But there was no recurrence of these strange hoof marks, and with time, the story of the devil's footprints became more folklore than fact. But it remains a compelling mystery that inspires new theories even today. One popular theory is that the tracks were left by an experimental balloon released by mistake from Devonport dockyard. The balloon left the tracks by trailing two shackles on the end of its mooring ropes. This theory came from author Geoffrey Household, who claimed his source was a local man named Major Carter, whose grandfather worked at Devonport at the time. Carter claimed the incident had been hushed up because the balloon also caused damage to several conservatories, greenhouses and windows. Whilst this could explain the shape of the prints and their ability to jump walls and haystacks, skeptics disagree about whether a balloon could travel such a long, zigzagging course without becoming entangled in a tree or other obstruction. Others believe that the prints were from an animal, like a wood mouse or badger. The print left behind when a mouse leaps resembles that of a cloven animal due to the motions of its limbs when it jumps. In July 1855, Professor Owen argued that a badger could be responsible since it was the only plantigrade quadruped we have in this island and leaves a footprint larger than would be supposed from its size. But with each new suggestion of a possible animal culprit, there are anomalies that preclude each species, whether it is that the hoof prints do not match the animal's tread, or that the animal must have been bipedal or cannot fly. However, the wind and rain on the night the prints were left may have disfigured the footprints' original formations. Perhaps the most likely culprit is the human imagination. In his paper, The Devil's Hoof Marks, researcher Mike Dash concluded that the prints were likely the combination of several different factors. Some of the tracks were likely hoaxes made after news of the original tracks began to spread. Others were made by donkeys and ponies or by birds and wood mice. Each of these sets of tracks were unremarkable and only slightly similar, but when linked together over 100 miles, they became the work of a single unknown beast. The lack of contemporary evidence and witness accounts means we will likely never know the true source of the devil's footprints. Some people are sure it was a balloon. Others believe it was a case of mass hysteria. Some have even attributed the prints to cryptids and, of course, aliens. Some, however, still believe that the devil walked through Devonshire on that snowy night in 1855. A strange occurrence indeed, and I'm sure it would have made a great addition to the tales collected by the fellows in our next story. Today, the Grimm brothers have almost become a folktale themselves. They've even inspired their own movie and television series. In one adaptation, the brothers, played by Matt Damon and Heath Ledger, run afoul of a fairy tale curse while working as con artists in 19th century Germany. In another, the Grimm fairy tales are true stories recorded by the brothers to help their descendants defeat supernatural entities. The most commonly held belief about the brothers Grimm was that they spent their lives travelling throughout Europe to collect and record these tales. But even that account of the brothers isn't really accurate. So who were the brothers Grimm? They weren't adventurers or demon hunters. They weren't even really authors. They were surprisingly academic librarians. Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm were born in 1785 and 1786 in Hanau, Germany. They spent their childhood in the countryside town of Stinau, where their family enjoyed prosperity and prominence. The brothers were privately educated by tutors at the family's large home until their father died unexpectedly in 1796. The burden of providing for their mother and their siblings drew the two elder brothers together, becoming inseparable for most of their lives. Jakob and Wilhelm studied law at the University of Marburg, but while there, they developed an interest in philology, the study of language in oral and written historical sources. Both brothers eventually became librarians at the Hessian State Library in Kassel. At their peers' urging, the brothers began collecting German folk tales and poetry. This work was of personal interest to Jakob and Wilhelm, who were seeking data on the German language for their linguistic studies, but it also held a political interest. Germany was divided into 30 states at the time, each with its own ruler and laws. The brothers felt this created a disjointed Germany and a decentralized national identity. But they also had no interest in a Germany united under a foreign emperor. Instead, the brothers desired a strong shared German national identity to stand up against outside forces. They believed that one way they could help create that national identity was through folklore. In 1812, the brothers published their first volume of 86 folk tales called Kinder- und Hausmärchen, or Children's and Household Tales. The title of the book was the brothers' way of warning people that not every story contained within the book was aimed at children. Many were indeed for the adults or household. The book was a success, and the two brothers spent the rest of their lives continually adding tales, even when their political leanings left them unemployed and dependent on friends. By the time Jakob died in 1859, their collection was in its 7th edition and had grown to over 200 stories and included illustrations. As I said, there is a common belief that the two brothers traversed across Germany and in some cases all of Europe to collect their fairy tales for their collection. But the truth is, the Grimms collected their stories mostly from friends and casual acquaintances within their own social circles. In fact, many of them were told by a girl who lived next door and would eventually become Wilhelm's wife. Her name was Henriette Dorothea Wilde, but her friends called her Dortchen. When she was a teen, Dortchen began telling stories to her neighbours. Her motivations were twofold. She wanted to help entertain the young Grimms, who had by then lost both of their parents, and she wanted to keep the attention of their older brother, who seemed especially interested in the tales she told by firelight. Later, Wilhelm would track Dortchen to her sister's house in Ninterhausen to hear more of her stories, and in 1825 he married her. It's believed that Dortchen was the brothers' source for much of their 1812 collection, including Rumpelstiltskin, Six Swans, The Frog King, The Elves and the Shoemaker, and The Singing Bone. In all, Dortchen told Wilhelm Grimm about a quarter of all the stories that appeared in his book. And it's believed that much of the collection was gathered this way. The brothers would simply invite people, mainly women, to tell them stories at social gatherings. Jakob and Wilhelm then edited the tales, adding dialogue and details that fit the linguistic aesthetic they hoped to achieve. It's likely that as the brothers became more widely known and respected, the sources for their stories became more varied. But it's primarily Dortchen we have to thank for their enduring legacy. Regardless of where the Grimms collected their tales, their life's work cemented these stories' place in culture and history. Unfortunately, not every chapter of that history is admirable. When Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party came to power in Germany, they too strove to shape German nationalism, though in a detestable way. The Nazis used many of Grimm's tales as propaganda to promote their anti-Semitic beliefs. Figures like Little Red Riding Hood and Cinderella were used as symbols of Aryan purity, whilst villains like the Big Bad Wolf were used to portray those who they felt threatened Germany, mainly Jewish people. There were plenty of anti-Semitic tropes ripe for Nazi usage in Grimm's tales, such as witches with stereotypical hooked noses and cannibalistic tendencies, often falsely attributed to Jewish populations throughout much of history. Some Grimm's stories read like Nazi propaganda long before Hitler's editors and illustrators got a hold of them. In the story, The Jew in the Brambles, the protagonist tortures a Jewish man by forcing him to dance in a thicket of thorns and hurling insults like dirty dog. The torment only stops when the Jewish man offers up his own money, and later a judge decides a Jewish person would never voluntarily give away money. The man is named a thief and is hanged. The effectiveness of using classic Grimm tales to propagandize German children was so great that many schools in Allied countries banned the fairy tales following World War II. Today, the stories have been reimagined in new contexts that distance the classic characters from their sordid past. But Nazi propaganda isn't the only skeleton in the Grimm's proverbial closet. In fact, many of the original fairy tales were so dark, it's hard to imagine reading them to a child. Cinderella is perhaps the most famous fairy tale in history, not just the Brothers Grimm version. The tale's origins can be traced back to a Chinese story from the 9th century called Ye Shen. In it, a beautiful and bright child was raised by a stepmother who was jealous of Ye Shen's beauty, for her own daughter was not pretty. When the evil stepmother discovered Ye Shen had made friends with a fish, she captured the creature and cooked it for dinner. In her grief, Ye Shen collected the bones of her friend, which a wise man told her were filled with a powerful spirit that could grant wishes when she was in need. After her stepmother forbade her from attending the spring festival, where young women often meet their future husbands, Ye Shen's fish bones granted her a beautiful dress and golden slippers. The girl attracted much attention at the festival, but was forced to flee when her stepsister noticed her, losing one precious slipper along the way. The king was determined to find the owner of the strange tiny shoe and announced it would be placed in a pavilion where the woman to whom it belonged could claim it. Ye Shen was desperate to retrieve the slipper to restore the fish bone's magic powers. And when she sneaked into the pavilion in the middle of the night, the king was so taken by her beauty that he married her. Her evil stepmother and sister were left to live in a cave, where they were eventually crushed to death by falling stones. Nearly every culture has its own version of Ye Shen, but our modern version is believed to be the work of French author Charles Perrault in 1697, who reimagined the heroine as Cendrillon and added in a pumpkin, a fairy godmother, and glass rather than golden slippers. This is the version we remain most familiar with, a stepmother with 2 daughters of her own who abuses Cinderella terribly. Her fairy godmother transforms a pumpkin into a carriage, gives her a shimmering gold and silver dress and a pair of glass slippers, and sends her on her way to a ball, where Cinderella and the prince fall in love. Left with only a single glass slipper as the sole clue to his new love's identity, the prince sets about trying the shoe on the foot of every maiden in the realm, eventually finding Cinderella. Ever the soul of kindness and grace, Cinderella forgives her wicked stepsisters and brings them to the palace. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm called their version of the classic story Aschenputtel, although Grimm's version shared much in common with Perrault's. It was noticeably darker. In this telling, as Cinderella's mother lies dying, she tells her daughter to plant a tree on her grave. She promises that when Cinderella wants something, she should shake the tree, and her mother will help her. After his wife's death, Cinderella's father remarries a woman with 2 arrogant, evil daughters. The stepmother forces poor Cinderella to sleep in the ashes of the kitchen hearth, wear old grey dresses, and do the bidding of her 2 stepsisters. When the king announces a 3-day ball where the prince would choose a wife, the stepsisters force Cinderella to help them prepare before leaving her to sort a basin of lentils. Cinderella quickly completes her chore with the help of a few friendly pigeons, then climbs to the top of the pigeon roost to watch the ball from afar. When the stepsisters learn that Cinderella has spent most of the evening watching the prince dance with eligible maidens, they tear down the pigeon roost in fury. On the second night of the ball, Cinderella's family leave her to sort out a sack full of seeds, threatening her that she will go without food if she makes a single mistake. Again, Cinderella completes her task with the help of the pigeons, who urge her to go to the tree at her mother's grave and ask for help. Cinderella shakes the tree and asks for nice clothes for the ball. The tree drops a silver dress, pearls, and silver slippers, and a carriage appears at her door. She goes to the ball and dances with the prince, but must leave before midnight. On the 3rd night of the ball, Cinderella once again asks the tree for help, receiving an even more splendid gown and golden slippers. This time the prince sought to stop her from running away and covered the stairway with hot, sticky pitch. When she flees at midnight, one of her gold slippers becomes stuck in the pitch, and the prince decides he will find Cinderella by having every maiden in the kingdom try on the golden slipper, promising to marry the woman whose foot fits inside the dainty shoe. When Cinderella's stepmother hears of the prince's plan, she tells her 2 daughters to do whatever they must to make the slipper fit. When the first stepsister takes the slipper to her bedroom to try it on, she finds only the front of her foot will fit. The sister slices off her heel and shows the prince, who agrees to marry her. As the pair walk to his carriage, the pigeons call out to the prince, who sees blood streaming from his would-be bride's shoe and realizes the deception. The second stepsister then tries the trick for herself, slicing off her toes so her foot will fit in the tiny slipper, but again the pigeons tell the prince of the deceit. Finally, the prince insists that Cinderella be called from the kitchen to try the slipper, which fits perfectly. The couple rides away to wed, leaving the crippled sisters and furious stepmother behind. The brothers Grimm updated their Aschenputtel several times as they continued to publish new versions of the collection of fairy tales, but Cinderella's story only got darker. In their final version, the brothers make the father a prominent character, well aware of the abuse that his daughter suffers, but unwilling to stop it. When the prince asks if any more daughters are in the house, the father says, "There is only a deformed little Cinderella from my first wife, but she cannot possibly be the bride." Perhaps a more satisfying update to the tale is the punishment of the evil stepsisters. When the two attend Cinderella and the prince's wedding, the pigeons peck out their eyes, leaving them blind in retaliation for their wickedness and lies. The story of Cinderella has been told and retold many hundreds of times since the Grimms popularised it, with the most beloved adaptations, tweaking the plot to make it more palatable. Less blood in the shoes, more animal friends, that sort of thing. With minor edits, the story of Cinderella is no longer the stuff of childhood nightmares. But not all Grimm fairy tales are so easily reworked into heartwarming stories. The classic story of Hansel and Gretel is still haunting in its more modern telling, lending itself more successfully to the horror genre than children's picture books. Unlike Cinderella, few changes were made to the later publications of Hansel and Gretel by the Grimms. The story remains essentially the same. A woodcutter and his family are suffering through a great famine. The wife convinces the woodcutter to abandon his two children in the woods to save herself and her husband. Hansel and Gretel overhear this plot, and Hansel fills his jacket pockets with white pebbles. The next day, the woodcutter and his wife lead the children deep into the wood and tell them to sleep beside a fire while they cut wood. The children awaken and discover they are alone. But thanks to Hansel secretly dropping pebbles on their way into the woods, they can follow the trail home. Again, Hansel and Gretel hear the parents plotting to leave them even deeper in the woods, but Hansel is unable to gather pebbles and instead uses breadcrumbs to create a trail as they are led deep into the forest. But when they try to follow the trail home, the children discover birds have eaten the crumbs. They wander the forest for days until they come across a little house made from bread, with a roof made of cake and windows of clear sugar. Whilst eating pieces of the house, a very old woman appears, inviting them inside, promising to keep them safe. But the old woman is really a witch, and poor old Hansel soon finds himself trapped in a cage being fattened up for the witch to eat. And Gretel is forced to haul water, build fires, and eat nothing but crayfish shells. Hansel fools the witch, who cannot see well, by sticking a chicken bone through the bars of his cage each morning when the witch checks to see if he's fattened up enough to cook. Eventually, the witch grows impatient and decides to eat Hansel, skinny or not. For good measure, she plans to trick Gretel into climbing into the oven to check the temperature, then trap her inside and cook her too. But Gretel realises the witch's plan and asks the old woman to show her how to climb inside. When she does, Gretel pushes her in, slams the door, and the witch burns up. The children find chests full of pearls and precious stones inside the witch's house, and fill their pockets with the treasures before finding their way back to the father's house. Hansel and Gretel's father is overjoyed his children are well and tells them that his wife has died while they were away. With the riches they took from the witch's bread house, the trio can live happily ever after. While the house made of bread and cake was purely imaginary, the circumstances that led to Hansel and Gretel being abandoned in the forest were chillingly very real. Families often went hungry in medieval Europe, but this fairy tale was likely inspired by the Great Famine of 1315. Across much of the continent, it rained nearly constantly throughout most of the summer and autumn of 1314, and then through most of the next 2 years. Crops rotted, harvests yielded nothing, and livestock drowned or starved. As supply dwindled, food prices soared. It was reported that even the King of England had difficulty procuring bread, since grain had to be dried before it could be used to bake. By the winter of 1315-1316, many peasants had resorted to eating the seed grain they had stored for planting in the spring. In some areas, people were forced to kill their dogs and horses for meat. There were even rumours of cannibalism. Starving and terrified, many resorted to unthinkable lengths to feed themselves and their families. They begged, stole, and even murdered for scraps of food. Many of the elderly voluntarily starved themselves so that the younger generations of their families could survive. However, there were many reports of infants and younger children being killed or abandoned to save their parents the heartache of watching them starve to death, or, like Hansel and Gretel's mother, to ensure they had enough food for themselves. It's estimated that about 5 to 15% of the entire population of Northern Europe died from starvation or related diseases. By the time the Grimms recorded the story of Hansel and Gretel, the Great Famine was a distant enough memory to be fodder for fairy tales. But there was a time when being left to starve in the forest only to stumble across a woman who wanted to eat you was perhaps more of a cautionary tale than a fantasy. With so much of Disney's success built on the foundations of Grimm's fairy tales, it's unsurprising that the company's first ever full-length animated film was a retelling of a Grimm classic, Little Snow White. The Disney version has plenty of darkness, with a wicked queen bent on killing her stepdaughter, a poisoned apple, and a terrifying talking mirror that calls to mind the classic Bloody Mary sleepover game of trying to summon a ghost in a dark bathroom. However, the Grimm version is even darker, starting with the little included in the title of their tale. In its original version, Snow White is not a young woman or even a teenager. She's 7 years old when her stepmother learns from her magic mirror that Snow is the fairest maiden in the kingdom. Overcome with envy, the evil queen summons a huntsman to take the child into the forest and kill her, asking him to bring back Snow's lungs and liver to prove she is dead. Just as the huntsman is about to stab her heart, Snow White convinces him to let her run away into the forest instead. Certain that wild animals would soon kill her anyway, the huntsman lets her go and brings the queen the lungs and liver of a young boar instead. The queen orders the cook to boil them with salt and settles into a meal of which she believes are the organs of her small stepdaughter. Meanwhile, Snow White finds her way to the home of 7 dwarves who agree to let her stay if she will keep the house, cook, make beds, wash, set, and knit for them. When the queen asks her magic mirror again, "Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" she is shocked that Snow White is still alive and 1,000 times fairer than she is. The queen disguises herself as an old peddler woman and goes to the home of the 7 dwarfs, where she convinces Snow to try out the lace bodice braided from coloured silk. The queen laces Snow's bodice so tightly the child drops dead, or so the queen thinks. The dwarves save Snow, and again the queen learns from the mirror that her stepdaughter is still alive. Again, she disguises herself as a peddler, tricking Snow into buying a poisoned comb. The dwarves save Snow White for a second time, but when the queen returns with a poisoned apple, they are unable to revive Snow again. The dwarves cried over Snow White's body for 3 days, but still she had rosy cheeks and appeared too alive to bury. Instead, they built a transparent glass coffin for Snow White and placed her on a mountainside, where she lay for a long, long time, never decaying. Eventually, a prince found the coffin and fell so in love with the dead girl that he begged the dwarfs to let him take her home. The prince refused to be parted from Snow and forced his servants to carry the coffin alongside him wherever he went. One day, a servant became so angry about hefting the glass coffin to and fro that he opened the case and hit Snow White. The blow dislodged the piece of the poisoned apple from her throat, and Snow White woke up. The overjoyed prince told her she would become his wife the next day. The evil queen dressed for the wedding, unaware that the queen-to-be was her stepdaughter, Snow White. Her magic mirror told her the young queen was the fairest of all, and the wicked woman could not stop herself from seeing who the beautiful new interloper was. After the queen discovered it was Snow White, she was presented with a pair of iron shoes heated over burning coals. The evil queen was forced to step into the red-hot shoes and dance until she fell dead. Apparently, the brothers Grimm had something of an affinity for mutilating the feet of their villains. There are many other instances where the Grimm's version of well-known fairy tales contain far more sinister elements than their contemporary counterparts. In the original version of Little Red Riding Hood, titled Little Red Cap, the big bad wolf arrives early and eats both the grandmother and Red. A passing woodcutter checks on Grandma and finds the wolf asleep in her bed. The woodcutter slices the wolf's stomach open, and both Red and her grandmother climb out. The trio fills the wolf with stones and celebrates their cleverness. In Grimm's Rapunzel, the girl with the long hair trapped in the tower is impregnated by her visiting prince, who throws himself from the tower window in grief after believing the sorceress has killed Rapunzel. The prince falls into thorns that poke out his eyes and wanders the forest, blind, for many years. Meanwhile, Rapunzel has been secreted away by the sorceress to live in the wilderness with the twins she gave birth to. The pair are eventually reunited and live happily ever after. It's easy to see why the original versions of these tales were heavily edited in modern times, but some were so dark that they've been left to languish in the Grimm collection, too disturbing to be modernized by even the fairy tale miners at Disney, or even Cocomelon. Perhaps the most horrific of all these is Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm's The Juniper Tree. Here is the story. A wealthy man and his beautiful, pious wife wished desperately for a child, but remained alone despite praying day and night. One day, the wife stood in front of their house eating an apple beside a juniper tree. While peeling the apple, she cut her finger and the blood fell into the snow. The woman looked at the blood and said, "If only I had a child as red as blood and as white as snow." Her wish was granted, and she became pregnant but grew very sick. She made her husband promise to bury her beneath the juniper tree. And when her son, red as blood and white as snow, was born, the woman was so happy she died. Her husband buried her beneath the tree, and though he grieved her greatly, he eventually remarried. The rich man and his second wife had a daughter together, and the wife began to resent the little boy who would inherit his father's wealth instead of her daughter. She took her anger out on the child, abusing him so terribly that the snow-white boy was terrified every moment he was at home. One day, the woman's little daughter, Marlene, asked her mother if she might have a beautiful ripe apple from a chest with a large heavy lid and sharp iron lock. The woman gladly gave her child the sweet fruit, but became filled with rage when Marlene asked if her brother might have one too when he returned from school. When the boy returned, the woman told him to take an apple from the chest, and as he bent over the fruit, the woman slammed down the heavy lid of the chest, slicing the boy's head off. The woman knew she had to hide what she'd done, so she set the boy in a chair by the door, tied his head back to his neck with a white scarf, and placed an apple in his hand. When Marlene saw her brother, she asked him for the apple, but he did not respond. Marlene told her mother about the boy. sitting so still and white and not answering her. And the woman told her daughter to ask again, and if he would not answer, to box his ears. So Marlene returned to her brother and asked again if she might have the apple he had held. When he did not answer, Marlene hit his ear, and his head fell off. The terrified Marlene ran to her mother and confessed through her tears that she had knocked her brother's head off. The woman said they could not let anyone know that Marlene had killed her brother, and took the little boy, chopped him into pieces, put him into a pot, and cooked him into a stew. When the father came home, the woman told him the boy had gone across the country to his mother's great uncle, where he would stay for a while. The father was sorrowful that his beloved son had left without saying goodbye, and assumed Marlene was also crying because she missed her brother. The father sat down to his stew, and with each bite seemed to grow hungrier and hungrier, until he had eaten the entire pot by himself, leaving a pile of bones beneath the table. Marlene gathered the bones in a silk scarf and placed them beneath the juniper tree, which began to move. A mist rose from the tree, a fire at its centre, and a beautiful bird flew from the flames. The bird flew away, landing on a goldsmith's house and singing, "My mother, she killed me. My father, he ate me. My sister Marlene gathered all my bones, tied them in a silken scarf, and laid them beneath the juniper tree. Tweet, tweet, what a beautiful bird I am." The goldsmith was so enchanted with the bird's song that he gave it a golden chain. The bird then sang its song to a shoemaker, who gave it a pair of red shoes. And finally, the bird went to a mill, where it was given a millstone for its song. Then the bird flew to his father's house. He held the gold chain in his right claw, and in his left was the red shoes. Around his neck was the millstone. The bird settled in the juniper tree and sang its song. The father and Marlene found the music beautiful, but the woman heard only a roaring in her ears and fire in her veins. The father went out to see the bird, who dropped the golden chain around his neck. Marlene went out next, and the bird threw the red shoes down to her. The woman felt the world was ending and decided to go out too, to see if the bird would make her feel better. But as she walked outside, the bird threw the millstone at her head, and she fell down dead. The bird then transformed back into the boy, took his father and Marlene by the hand, and led them back into the house, where they sat down at the table to eat, forgetting the child abuse, murder, and cannibalism entirely. The evolution of Grimm's fairy tales from their original dark and often gruesome narratives to the sanitized versions we know today reflects societal changes in values, norms, and the purpose of storytelling. Many of these stories were initially intended as cautionary tales that mirrored the harsh realities of early 19th century life, and their evolution into the more romanticized fairy tales we know today has allowed them to remain relevant for centuries. And though we would not share these dark versions with children now, revisiting them in their most sinister form is still endlessly entertaining. Stories and their characters can be a powerful tool. For instance, Captain Ludd, though he wasn't an actual person, helped lead an uprising. On the night of the 9th of June 1817, an act of disorder and violence occurred in rural Derbyshire in the East Midlands of England. That evening, hundreds of people gathered in the small village of South Wingfield. Some had improvised weapons, scythes and other farming tools. Others had pikes and even guns. They then began marching to the nearby village of Pentridge. The main body of the group was made up of unemployed quarrymen, smiths and textile workers, all led by one, Jeremiah Brandreth. He himself an out-of-work stocking maker. As the group were assembling, they went house to house looking for men to join them, and when they arrived at the home of widow Mary Hepworth, she refused to let them in. Enraged, one member of the group smashed a window, through which Brandreth let loose a shot from his gun. This struck and killed a servant. Jeremiah's plan was for revolution. He envisaged his motley crew attacking local barracks, overthrowing the government, wiping out national debt, and ending poverty forever. However, this wasn't to be. News quickly spread of the unrest, and early on the 10th of June, the 15th Regiment of Light Dragoons intervened to break up the mob and arrest dozens of those involved. Trials were soon held, and several individuals were shipped off to the British penal colonies in Australia. Brandreth and two others who led what have become known as the Pentridge Riots became the last three people to ever be executed in Britain by being beheaded with an axe. This was one of the most infamous incidents in the history of what was known as the Luddite movement, a social protest movement which emerged in Britain in the late 18th century in response to the advent of industrialization. But who were the Luddites, and how did their actions result in bloodshed at Pentridge in 1817? The Luddites emerged as a result of revolutionary changes in the socio-economic life of England that began in the middle of the 18th century. From as early as 1600, a number of innovations were occurring in Britain in terms of creating greater efficiencies in industrial activity. The number of mines and ironworks, for instance, expanded, while in 1712 Thomas Newcomen invented the first atmospheric steam engine that could use steam created from burning wood or coal to produce mechanical energy. As the 1700s progressed, several individuals in England realised that they could increase their profits from the refining of cotton and wool into textiles if they set up large buildings dedicated to textile manufacturing. They called these new buildings factories. Before long, the steam engines were being used to power new giant weaving machines that both increased production and reduced the need for expensive human labour. Thus began the first industrial revolution. Though industrialization would soon stretch into all sectors of developed economies, early on it was primarily concerned with coal mining, metalwork and textile production. But not everyone was delighted at these new developments. As early as the 1770s, there was already growing discontent concerning the manner in which industrialization would deprive people of work they and their families had relied on for generations for their livelihoods. Soon this murmuring would coalesce into a movement. The origins of the Luddites have taken on an almost mythical nature. It is believed that Ned Ludd was their founder, and it was from his name that they derived their moniker. According to Luddite law, Ludd was an apprentice stockinger, the name for a person who produced finished textiles using a stocking frame, a kind of knitting frame which was used to speed up the knitting process by introducing a mechanical element to it. The irony is that the stocking frame was itself not such an old device, having been invented in the late 16th century, so stockingers had not so long ago replaced those who sewed by hand in many parts of England. Ludd was perturbed in the late 1770s when his employer began introducing new and more advanced textile machines to his workshop, such as the spinning jenny, a multi-spindle frame device that had been invented in the mid-1760s and which was a cornerstone of the advent of the first industrial revolution. The spinning jenny was far more efficient than previous devices and would soon see a single stockinger able to carry out the work of 3 or 4 people. Ludd apparently was unhappy with the introduction of such machines and seemed unwilling to learn how to use one. It's said that his master was advised that a little whipping was required to make him conform. However, this only served to enrage Ned, who instead of learning how to use the new machines, took a great hammer and destroyed them. At least this is one version of the story. The first written account of this dates to 1811, when it appeared in the pages of the Nottingham Review, but there is nothing to independently verify these events, which purportedly occurred further back in 1779. Because of this, we can't be sure if Ned Ludd was actually a real person or not. Whatever the truth of Ned Ludd's existence and actions, we do know that his story took on a mythical element in the decades that followed. By the beginning of the 19th century, there was an entire movement of individuals in England who were dedicated to destroying the machines which they believed would soon replace them entirely in the new factories. Over time, these industrial skeptics became known as Luddites, and they referred to Ned Ludd as King Ludd or General Ludd. Those who destroyed machinery would often give his moniker as their name when captured by authorities. While some believe that there were Luddites operating from as early as the 1770s, in reality, they were primarily active in the 1800s and 1810s. During these years, groups of Luddites vandalised industrial machinery in factories and workshops across England. This then escalated from 1811 onwards into acts of violent riot and affray in individual towns and cities. Across 1811 and 1812, there was extensive Luddite violence in Nottinghamshire and other places in the north of England where the main industrial centres were. Before long, the group had become highly organised, with local associations meeting at night to plan their activities and engage in quasi-military drills. Riots ensued, some resulting in death either of rioters or those who dared to use the new machinery. On a more subtle level, the workers simply sabotaged machines in the factories they worked in clandestinely. Thus, in the early 1810s, the Luddites became a growing movement and a worrying one for the British government. There were major underlying reasons for this. Since 1792, Britain had been almost constantly at war since the British, Prussians and Austrians intervened in France in an effort to crush the French Revolution as it became more and more radical. In 1803, the French Revolutionary Wars had morphed into the Napoleonic Wars after the rise to power of Napoleon Bonaparte as first consul and then emperor of the French. By 1807, with the signing of the Treaty of Tilsit, Napoleon had conquered or brought on side the vast majority of continental Europe, with only Russia and Britain unvanquished. Bonaparte had then introduced an economic boycott of Britain called the Continental System, which required all of Europe to refuse to trade with the British. The Continental System and over 2 decades of nigh-on continuous warfare had impacted greatly on the British economy, and the kinds of ordinary workers who joined the Luddites in the early 1810s were worst hit by the French blockade. In an age before people knew how economic cycles worked, industrial workers had blamed the machines in their factories when people were let go owing to wider economic concerns, worried that they would be next. This only served to fuel the fire of the Luddite movement. Their protest peaked in the mid-1810s. Indeed, the Pentridge riots in the summer of 1817 were one of the last major recorded incidents associated with the group. Their eventual demise came down to 3 primary reasons. Firstly, there was the British government's response to the lawlessness and violence that were a growing aspect of the riot. As early as 1812, the Destruction of Stocking Frames Act was passed by Parliament, one which aimed to increase the legal penalty for sabotaging or vandalising industrial machinery associated with the textile industry. In early 1813, a mass trial in the city of York saw many Luddites convicted for crimes of this nature, emphasising the government's determination to crack down on the unrest. Secondly, the broader economic conditions which led to the unrest improved. The Napoleonic Wars had come to an end in the summer of 1815 with the final defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. After a period of economic recovery, trade boomed again in the later parts of the decade and into the 1820s. The shift towards ever greater amounts of free trade between countries like Britain and France in the mid-19th century, along with the spread of the Industrial Revolution to places like Germany, Belgium and the Dutch Republic, soon saw living standards improving all over Europe. This led to a decline in the kind of disenchantment which led to the Luddite movement in the first place. Thirdly, and finally, generational change simply took effect. As the older generations who had grown up in an age before the spread of the new machines grew old and passed away, they were replaced by younger people who had never known anything different and were acclimatized to living in a world of steam machines and mechanical efficiencies. Moreover, they soon learned that new jobs, building factories, working in the ever-growing numbers of coal mines or laying down railway tracks from the late 1820s onwards would replace the old jobs that were lost. Thus, there was little Luddite movement to speak of from the 1820s onwards. However, the movement left behind an indelible mark on our historical imaginations. The term Luddite is still used to describe someone who refuses to accept social or technological change. In the years ahead, as artificial intelligence begins to enter more widespread use in the economy, there will probably be more frequent reference to the Luddite movement in public discourse. If we can take any solace from history, the one thing that should reassure people is that the Industrial Revolution led to a change in jobs, not an overall decline in the amount of work available. Though, if you wanted to face these new developments as the Luddites did, we wouldn't blame you. A controversial invention is at the heart of our next tale as we explore the history of the electric chair. On August 6, 1890, 30-year-old William Kemmler was awakened at 5:30 a.m. He dressed in his best suit, a crisp white shirt and a necktie. He ate breakfast and spent time in prayer. The sun rose, bathing Auburn, New York, in a pleasant late summer warmth. William Kemmler visited a barber that morning. He asked the man with the clippers to mind the beautiful Hyperion curl that fell across his forehead. Once the haircut was complete, he joined a handful of other men on a short walk to where they would conduct their business that day. But he was not bound for a meeting at the bank or a shift at work. He was about to become the first person ever to be executed by the electric chair, a moment nearly 10 years in the making. Before Kemmler's historical walk to the execution room at Auburn Prison, prisoners condemned to die had faced similar final moments en route to a variety of instruments of death. The first death penalty laws can be traced back all the way to the 18th century BC. The traditional British method of hanging followed colonists to the New World and was a common practice there for nearly 200 years. But following the publication of Cesare Beccaria's On Crimes and Punishment, many began to wonder if legitimizing the very behavior the law seeks to repress was counterproductive in the moral message it conveyed. The Bill of Rights adopted in 1789 included the Eighth Amendment, which prohibited cruel and unusual punishment. And by the early 1800s, many states had reduced the number of capital crimes and built state prisons to house criminals for long, sometimes lifetime, sentences. In 1847, Michigan abolished the death penalty altogether, and other state legislatures began to feel pressured to review their laws on execution. The general population was growing increasingly unsupportive of hanging, which was still the most frequent method of dispatching those condemned to death. While simple in theory, hanging a person to death is no small feat. Newspapers across the country were full of stories of hangings gone wrong, broken ropes required do-overs, incorrectly measured drops resulted in decapitation, and sometimes prisoners took up to an hour to die. the pain and suffering visible to those who looked on in despair. In 1860, the New York legislature passed a bill that repealed hanging as an approved method of execution. The lawmakers failed to prescribe an alternative method, thereby unintentionally abolishing capital punishment in the state. New York's population dwarfed that of other states, so unsurprisingly, it had a larger prison population as well, making the implications of the repeal of hanging significant. A New York Court of Appeals ruled the statute unconstitutional, and Governor Edwin Morgan quickly signed legislation to restore capital punishment. But a seed had been planted, and many New Yorkers demanded change. By the time David Hill was elected to the state's highest office, ratification of the 13th Amendment had further fanned the flames of the reform movement, with northern states eager to distance themselves from the growing association of hangings with mob lynchings. In 1886, the newly appointed governor established the New York Commission to find an alternative to hanging. The commission included just 3 members: human rights activist and reformer Thomas Jerry, lawyer and politician Matthew Hale, and a dentist from Buffalo named Alfred P. Southwick. Southwick, a former steamboat engineer, had seen an opportunity to develop new tools and mechanical devices to aid dentists after attending the founding convention of the American Dental Association in 1859. He became so excited by the field that he apprenticed himself to a local dentist and eventually opened his own dental practice in downtown Buffalo. There, he treated patients by day and researched by night, designing an implant for cleft palates that earned him recognition from the New York Dental Association. A natural experimenter, Alfred first became interested in low-voltage electricity as a possible pain-numbing agent during dental treatment. But when a Buffalo dock worker was accidentally electrocuted in 1881, he saw another possibility for the new technology. The dentist was a proponent of capital punishment in theory, but was troubled by the reports of bungled hangings. When he learned that George Smith's body had been unmarked after his unfortunate encounter with an electrical generator, apparently dead on contact, Southwick was inspired. He began experimenting with electrocuting animals, but was having difficulty determining the correct voltage to deliver instantaneous death. After one test, Southwick mused about his findings with a patient, a New York State senator. The senator then informed Governor Hill about what he had been told, and the dentist was asked to join the commission. Southwick, Hale, and Jerry spent a year reviewing both ancient and modern methods of execution, detailing the benefits and drawbacks of each. Their report included the consideration of 34 different techniques, including boiling, burning, flaying, throwing from a cliff, shooting, and suffocation. They were searching for a quick, humane, and efficient method. But the report concluded, "Your commission have examined with care the accounts which exist of the various curious modes of capital punishment that have been used. The result is that none of these can be considered as embodying suggestions of improvement over that now in use in this state." It was true that none of the existing methods could be considered humane. Beheading, which was the most widely used method of execution outside of hanging, was a bloody spectacle. Public spectators were prone to rowdy behavior, and the execution was easily botched by a dull blade or incorrectly assembled guillotine. Plus, there were questions about consciousness and awareness following decapitations, with reports of eyes still blinking and other facial movements following the deadly swing. Prussic acid, also known as hydrogen cyanide, and other poisons were still imprecise, making it difficult to estimate how long death by ingestion, inhalation, or injection might take. Using a hypodermic needle to administer such toxins was viewed by many as contrary to the Hippocratic Oath, and the committee feared it would be challenging to find physicians willing to administer a lethal injection. Other methods, like tossing the condemned over a cliff or handing them over to wild beasts, were inaccessible to most executioners, not to mention indisputably cruel. But the Commission offered an alternative method of execution, which had never before been tried but was thrillingly promising. Southwick told Governor Hill, "Electricity is the coming power. Death is instantaneous and the body is not defaced." Having worked on patients in his dental chair for so many years, Southwick naturally imagined a chair in his execution design. The condemned would be strapped to the seat and connected to an electrical current, theoretically stopping their heart instantly. But with lingering questions about the correct voltage, he sought help from the father of electricity himself, Thomas Edison. Edison, who opposed capital punishment, initially declined to involve himself in the project. However, when he realized there may be a personal incentive to help create the first electric chair, he changed his mind. In 1879, Thomas Edison developed the first practical incandescent light bulb, supported by his own direct current electrical system. In a direct current, or DC, the electrons run continually in a single direction at a constant voltage, like in a battery or a fuel cell. Edison knew his DC system had limitations, since it was difficult to transmit over distances without significant energy loss. Seeking solutions, he turned to a 28-year-old mathematician and engineer he'd recently hired at Edison Machine Works by the name of Nikola Tesla. Tesla told Edison that the future of electric distribution was in alternating current, or AC. In AC systems, the direction of the current reverses or alternates dozens of times per second. AC would allow high voltage energy to be transmitted over long distances using a lower current, allowing a much more efficient delivery system than Edison's DC system. Thomas Edison dismissed Tesla's ideas as splendid but utterly impractical. The young engineer left Edison in 1885 and perfected his AC technology, receiving a number of patents. In 1888, he sold his patent to industrialist George Westinghouse, whose electric company had become Edison's biggest competitor. Within a year, Westinghouse began installing AC generators around the country, focusing on less populated areas that Edison's DC system could not reach, but also making headway in large cities, selling electricity at a loss to cut into Edison's business. Knowing the DC system could not rival Westinghouse's AC generators in efficiency and cost, Edison focused on safety instead. When he received Southwick's letter, Edison saw his chance. He wrote back that although he would join heartily in an effort to totally abolish capital punishment, he did have some thoughts about electric currents in which to dispose of criminals under sentence of death. Edison told Southwick that to ensure death, they must use alternating current machines manufactured by Westinghouse in Pittsburgh. He then began publicly demonstrating the lethal power of the AC current. In June of 1888, Edison invited reporters to watch as he rigged a sheet of tin to an AC dynamo and led a dog onto the tin to drink from a metal pan. Once the dog touched the metal surface, it fell dead. Edison told reporters that AC electricity would kill a man in the 10,000th of a second. After experimenting with dozens of stray dogs purchased from neighborhood children for 25 cents each, Edison arranged a demonstration before the New York State Committee to showcase the use of electricity in execution. He wired electrodes to several calves and a horse. And though the animals' deaths were not instant or even quick, the committee was impressed with the promise this new form of execution showed. On June 4, 1888, Governor Hill signed a bill making electrocution New York's approved form of execution to go into effect on January 1, 1889. New York State told Westinghouse they wished to purchase 3 of his alternating current dynamos, but Edison's competitor was wise to his plan to malign his technology and refused. The small act of defiance did little to slow the march toward the electric chair. Harold Brown, an obscure inventor and electrical engineer who frequented Edison's West Orange laboratory, worked alongside one of Edison's assistants to determine the lethality of various currents. In July 1888, Brown publicized his findings with a macabre demonstration at the School of Mines at Columbia University. A large Newfoundland mix from the local SPCA was muzzled, loaded into a wire cage, and connected to a pair of cables. First, the poor beast was subjected to a series of DC shocks in increasing voltages. At 1000 volts DC, the dog was in obvious agony, but still alive. The process had been so uncomfortable for the audience that many people left the room. Then Brown promised to make the poor dog feel better, administering a shock of 330 volts AC that instantly killed the dog. Brown concluded that AC electricity should be permitted only in pounds slaughterhouses and prisons. When the electrical execution law took effect on the first day of 1889, Dr. Carlos MacDonald, the superintendent of the State Asylum for Insane Criminals, wrote to Harold Brown asking for him to provide a design and price estimate for an electric chair. Brown sought help from Edison, explaining that the state of New York would only pay for the equipment if the device worked. He asked Edison for several $1,000s to purchase the Westinghouse generators he would need to make his design successful. Together, the two men devised a scheme to acquire the AC generators through the Thornton-Houston Company, a major competitor to both Edison and Westinghouse. Thornton-Houston worked through another party to purchase second-hand Westinghouse generators. Brown instructed his collaborators to waterproof the generators, transport them in unmarked containers, and store them under lock and key to avoid interference from Westinghouse. With the generators secured, Brown set about designing his deadly contraption. He believed the condemned's hands and feet should be saturated with a weak potash solution to overcome the skin's resistance to the jolt. They should then be shod in wet felt slippers and strapped into the chair with their hands and feet placed in a foot tub and hand basins containing the potash solution. The warden of Auburn Prison was unhappy with Brown's design and tasked the prison's electrician, Edwin F. Davis, with devising a simpler method. Davis's chair more closely resembled our modern-day electric chair, with a head electrode. A second electrode was pressed to the base of the spine, eventually to be replaced by calf electrodes in later years. The headpiece resembled a toilet plunger that housed a sponge-covered brass plate. The sponge was to be soaked in the same potash solution Brown had initially suggested. The entire apparatus was tested on large pieces of beef and by administering low-voltage shocks to volunteering physicians. But it had yet to be fully tested on humans when William Kemmler was sentenced to death. Kemmler was a vegetable peddler in the slums of Buffalo whose parents were both German immigrants and alcoholics. Raised in a neglectful household, he dropped out of school at age 10, unable to read or write. On March the 29th, 1889, Kemmler was recovering from a drinking binge when he got into a fight with his partner, Tilly Ziegler. He accused her of stealing from him and planning to run away with his friend. In the middle of their argument, he went to the barn, retrieved a hatchet, and returned to the house. He struck Tilly with the weapon repeatedly until dead. Then he went to a neighbour's house and told them of his wicked act. He was eventually convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Another convicted murderer, Joseph Chaplot, was slated to be the first to die in the electric chair after beating his neighbour to death, but his sentence was commuted to life in prison, moving Kemmler to the front of the line. George Westinghouse, who feared the public's reaction to seeing his product used for execution, hired an appeal attorney for the condemned man, spending $100,000 of his personal fortune for the cause. The lawyer filed an appeal claiming the electric chair violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment, but was unsuccessful in overturning the sentence. Kemmler's execution was scheduled for August the 8th, 1890. On that fateful day, he entered the execution room with Auburn Warden Charles Durston at 6:38 a.m. A cluster of over 20 witnesses were present to observe the execution and witness the electric chair in use on a human for the first time. While the device sat waiting and a hidden team of electricians worked behind the scenes next door, Kemmler was delivering his final statement. He said, "Gentlemen, I wish everyone all the good luck in the world. I believe I am going to a good place. The papers have been saying a lot of stuff that ain't so. That's all I have to say." Kemmler was notably calm and poised for being something akin to a human guinea pig. Dr. George Shardy later said, "It was the most wonderful exhibition of nerve that I have ever saw." He came into the execution room with the manner of a man who was about to do a heroic deed. After his introduction, Warden Durston asked William to remove his coat and cut a small hole in the back of the prisoner's shirt where one of the electrodes would be placed. Then he sat in the electric chair as Deputy Sheriff Joseph Voling strapped him in. The sheriff was so nervous that he forgot to strap one of Kemmler's arms, and he had to be reminded by the condemned. Two other officers then placed a leather mask over his face. As the warden moved to attach the electrode to the top of his head, Kemmler asked that he take his time, making sure everything was right. Once everything was in place, Kemmler said his final words. "Well, I want to do the best I can, and I can't do any better than that." One of the attending physicians said, "God bless you, Kemmler. You have done well." The witnesses murmured their agreement, perhaps surprised at the poise and humanity the prisoner exhibited in his final moments. Another physician wetted the sponges around the two electrodes with a bulb syringe. At 6:43, Durston signalled the anteroom where Edwin Davis waited, and the switch was thrown. If the electric chair works perfectly, the current destroys the conscious nervous system, which controls pain and awareness in a fraction of a second. The automatic nervous system, including the heart, follows immediately after. Protocol for electrocutions varies by state, but usually involves an initial jolt of over 2,000 volts to cause instant death. A slightly lower voltage is delivered, sometimes for several minutes, to ensure the prisoner's heart does not restart. If completed correctly, the prisoner would show little sign of pain, merely a slight convulsion. Kemmler's execution appeared to go according to plan, with witnesses seeing a quick convulsive start of the bound figure in the chair and a little squeaking sound of the straining straps. The current of just under 2,000 volts was applied for 17 seconds before Durston ordered it turned off. An attending physician declared Kemmler dead, and the prison officials seemed pleased with the process. Southwick, who was present to see his invention in action, declared, "There is the culmination of 10 years of work and study. We live in a higher civilization from this day." Seconds later, Kemmler's chest heaved, and he let out an audible groan. A doctor yelled for the current to start again. The voltage was increased, and the switch was thrown again, this time for nearly 4 minutes. From a successful outing for a new invention, the scene quickly turned to one of pure horror. Blood vessels under Kemmler's skin burst and bled. Smoke began to curl up around the chair, and some witnesses were sure they saw flames on Kemmler's skull. Many of those in attendance couldn't stand to watch. At least one witness fainted, and the smell of burning hair and flesh filled the room. One reporter later wrote, "Saliva came from the mouth, the chest heaved, and there was wheezing in the throat." After a short time, smoke appeared at the base. His flesh was burning. The spectacle was most trying. Nearly 8 minutes after the execution began, William Kemmler was finally declared dead. This time, correctly. The next day, headlines were less than complimentary of the first execution using electricity. One read, "Kemmler's execution amounts to scientific butchery." Another said, "Electricity as wretched a blunderer as the dethroned hangman." Dr. Schrady said of the event, "I have seen many men hanged, and I must say, there is nothing in the old method so revolting as the scene I have witnessed this morning." The execution was decidedly not reassuring as to the scientific value of electricity as a means of execution. Another witness, C.R. Huntley, said, "No one can depict in words the apparent horrible suffering of that poor devil. Everyone in the room lost their head. I would not think $1,000 an inducement for witnessing another electrocution." George Westinghouse, who'd been outspoken about this use of his technology since Edison first suggested it, said, "They would have done better with an axe." His competitor fired back by stating he believed that future executions by AC current would go more smoothly for convicted criminals who were Westinghoused. Kemmler's autopsy would reveal that blood vessels under the electrode cap on his skull had carbonized, and the top of his brain had hardened. The electrode at his back had burned a hole all the way through to the spine. But the doctors would conclude that the first blast of electricity had been successful in rendering the man unconscious. They felt confident that he had not felt any pain from the second jolt. They thought Kemmler had not died instantly because of inadequate voltage or improper contact of the electrodes, a fault of the machine, not the method. While there was some initial public outcry and speculation that the next legislature would immediately repeal the use of the electric chair, without a viable alternative, the device was accepted as the new standard for execution. Despite the grisliness of the first execution, even the electric chair's harshest critics agreed that the condemned had been rendered unconscious immediately and therefore had not experienced any pain, satisfying Governor Hill's request of providing a more humane alternative to hanging. In the wake of Kemmler's execution, Dr. Carlos MacDonald commented, "While this is not so great a success as I had hoped it would be, it is demonstrated to my mind that this method is infinitely preferable to hanging. I believe that there should be some central place in the state where executions should take place and be in the hands of men specially fitted to perform them in a perfect manner. It's an outrage and a terrible hardship to place this duty on the shoulders of the wardens of our state prisons. The legislature agreed that standardizing the procedure and placing the burden of execution on experts was necessary. Edwin Davis was appointed official state electrocutioner. From 1890 to 1914, he would perform 240 executions. The method was adopted by Ohio in 1897, Massachusetts in 1900, New Jersey in 1906, and Virginia in 1908. Within little more than a decade, it quickly replaced hanging as the prevalent form of execution in the US. However, Edison was unsuccessful in his efforts to discredit AC. Westinghouse beat out General Electric, which was formed in 1892 after a merger with Edison's company, for a contract to supply electricity to the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. They also earned a contract to construct the generators for a hydroelectric power plant at Niagara Falls. By 1896, the plant was delivering power all the way to Buffalo, over 25 miles away. By then, General Electric was also using alternating currents, effectively ending the long battle that became known as the War of Currents. The year after the gruesome initial execution, the electric chair was used again, this time for a mass execution at Sing Sing, one of the world's most notorious prisons. The death house, as Death Row was known at Sing Sing, opened in 1890 with 14 cells and an execution chamber. The electric chair was located so close to the cells that inmates could hear the humming of the electric cables, the final words of the condemned, and the painful cries of botched executions. On July 7, 1891, the executions of convicted murderers Joseph Wood, James Slocum, Levi Smiler, and Shibuya Jugiro took place back-to-back, beginning at 4:30 a.m. For hours, the inmates in the death house listened to the sounds of the wholesale execution and subsequent autopsies. In addition to Sing Sing, New York State installed an electric chair at the Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora. The site saw its first execution using the new method in 1892, when Cal Wood was put to death for the murder of his father-in-law. Wood's execution went as flawlessly as possible, with witnesses reporting that there were not even any convulsions of the body, only a slight expansion of the chest. The entire operation was done within 2 minutes. When the mask was removed from Wood's face, witnesses noted there was not a sign of a burn, not the slightest injury to the skin. The eyes were closed, the lids being drawn tightly together. The mouth was passive, showing no signs of pain. The papers reported the execution as well conducted and a complete success. One article proclaimed, "There is nothing horrifying about electrocution save the terrible thought that the life of a human being is about to be cut off." That terrible thought was likely rife in Sing Sing on March the 20th, 1899. While 10 others had been executed in the electric chair in New York since William Kemmler, all up until that point had been men. On March the 20th, a woman named Martha Place sat in the chair. It was, perhaps, the ultimate test for the electric chair. If hanging had fallen out of favor in large part due to the public unease with seeing women swing, what would happen if a woman suffered as Kemmler had? Surely the new instrument of death would be outlawed. Martha Place had been found guilty of killing her 17-year-old stepdaughter Ida by splashing acid in the girl's face during an argument and then smothering her to death. It was a horrific crime, but Martha had a tragic backstory of her own. At age 23, she'd been struck in the head by a moving sleigh and never fully recovered from her injuries. Though she married and had a son, her husband, abandoned the family, and Martha was forced to give up her only child for adoption. She found work as a housekeeper for a man named William Pace in Brooklyn. The two married, and Martha inherited a stepdaughter, Ida. The promising new start soured when she developed a deep jealousy of her stepdaughter. On the day of her death, Ida took William's side in an argument against her stepmother. After her husband left for work, Martha took the acid he typically used to develop photographs and threw it into Ida's eyes. She then smothered the girl with bedding, retrieved an axe from the cellar, and waited for William. When he returned home, Martha struck him with the weapon. He managed to escape and ran from the house in search of help, while Martha attempted to kill herself in the kitchen by turning on the gas. When police arrived, she was in critical condition, but alive. At her murder trial, Martha Place was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Still, she and her attorney believed she would be spared at the last minute, since the electric chair had never been used on a woman. Two others before her had been sentenced to die by the new method, and neither had been executed in the end. Serial killer Lizzie Halliday was the first woman sentenced to death by the electric chair in 1894, but was spared after Governor Roswell Flower commuted her sentence. Halliday, who murdered at least 4 people in upstate New York in the 1890s, was resentenced to life in a mental institution after a medical commission declared her insane. She was sent to the Matteawan State Hospital, where she was initially a model patient. Halliday was trusted with access to sewing tools and given other privileges because of her good behavior. But in 1906, she learned that her favorite nurse had plans to leave the institution. Halliday stabbed Nurse Nellie Wicks 200 times with a pair of scissors, killing her. In 1895, Maria Barbella was sentenced to death by the electric chair after being found guilty of murdering Domenico Cataldo. Barbella could not speak or understand English at the time of her trial, and while she admitted to slashing Cataldo's throat after he refused to marry her, Barbella was unable to communicate her entire story with the jurors. Cataldo had allegedly drugged and sexually assaulted Barbella, and then promised to marry her to save her the public shame of the situation he had created. In reality, Cataldo was already married to a woman in Italy and had 3 children. Barbella confronted him in a bar after Cataldo shouted, "Only a pig can marry you." Barbella slashed his neck with a straight razor. He stumbled into the street and died in a gutter. While Barbella was convicted of first-degree premeditated murder, many felt her actions did not warrant the death penalty. She insisted she had never intended to kill Cataldo, only to scare him and attract the attention of the police. She believed she could explain her situation to law enforcement, who would force Cataldo to marry her and save her from social ruin. Barbella won an appeal that granted her a new trial. This time, her defense counsel persuaded the jury that she was a victim of sexual assault and had suffered an epileptic seizure during her argument with Cataldo, which caused her to lose her reasoning and accidentally, mortally wound him. She was found not guilty and released from Sing Sing. With 2 successful appeals before hers, Martha Place felt her chances of seeing the electric chair were nil. Her defense counsel sought assistance from then-Governor Theodore Roosevelt, but the newly elected leader refused to have Martha's sentence commuted to life in prison. He said, "My sympathies in criminal cases are for the wronged and not the wrongdoer." The Brooklyn murderess, as she'd been dubbed, was stunned when on March the 20th she was led to the execution room in Sing Sing's death house. Martha's gender did prove something of a challenge for her executioners. Shaving her long, thick hair was out of the question. Such an act would be deemed cruel and unusual punishment in its own right. Instead, it was lightly clipped, and the electrodes were fitted to her forehead. The long skirt of her black dress was slit so that electrodes could be placed on her ankles without exposing them to the witnesses, determined to protect her modesty until the very end. According to the reports of witnesses, Martha Place died instantly after muttering her final words, "God help me." The seemingly painless and quick death of the first woman to be executed by the electric chair cemented the new method's dominance in New York's penal system. In the next few years, the chairs at Sing Sing, Auburn, and Dannemora saw the final moments of notorious killers like Leon Czolgosz, who assassinated President William McKinley in 1901, bank robber, murderer James P. Whitey Sullivan, and the three Van Wormer brothers who were convicted of killing their uncle after he foreclosed on the mortgage of the family's cottage. Even as the use of the electric chair became more common, many still wondered if the process was as immediate and painless as proponents of the new execution method promised. After all, no one had walked away from the electric chair to tell their story. Then, in 1916, a man named Harry Tonius gave a first-hand account of his electrocution that gave some insight into what the process might feel like. Tonius, who worked for the National Screw and Tack Company in Cleveland, was pushing a hand truck of steel casings into a freight elevator when his left foot touched a live wire that had accidentally detached from the electric controller of the elevator. When the ambulance arrived, paramedics declared Tonius dead, but at the hospital, surgeons wishing to experiment with the new pulmotor resuscitator were able to revive him. Once recovered, Tonius was able to give a detailed account of his electrocution, saying, "It felt as if a bomb had been inserted in my skull and as if it had exploded and blown off the top of my head." He also said, "The pain seemed to keep up for years. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't even fight it with my mind. And then I felt something pulling at my heart. It was as if someone had put his hand inside my breast and was pulling everything out." Hardly the pain-free instant death Alfred Southwick had believed his new method of execution would provide. Botched executions, shifting views on capital punishment, and stories like Harry Tonius's made many state legislatures rethink the role of the death penalty. Between 1895 and 1917, 9 states abolished capital punishment altogether. U.S. Congress passed a bill reducing the number of federal death crimes, and votes in many other states came close to ending the death penalty, establishing a long-running debate about the government's role in mandating death. And despite some changes to the electric chair, the process remains nearly identical to the one invented by Edwin Davis. The following is a description of the process from the Death Penalty Information Center. For execution by the electric chair, the person is usually shaved and strapped to a chair with belts that cross his chest, groin, legs, and arms. A metal skull cap-shaped electrode is attached to the scalp and forehead over a sponge moistened with saline. The sponge must not be too wet, or the saline short-circuits the electric current, and not too dry, as it would then have a very high resistance. An additional electrode is moistened with conductive jelly, electrode cream, and attached to a portion of the prisoner's leg that has been shaved to reduce resistance to electricity. The prisoner is then blindfolded. After the execution team has withdrawn to the observation room, the warden signals the executioner, who pulls a handle to connect the power supply. A jolt of between 500 and 2000 volts, which lasts about 30 seconds, is given. The current surges and is then turned off, at which time the body is seen to relax. The doctors wait a few seconds for the body to cool down and then check to see if the prisoner's heart is still beating. If it is, another jolt is applied. This process continues until the prisoner is dead. The prisoner's hands often grip the chair, and there may be violent movement of the limbs, which can result in dislocation or fractures. The tissues swell, defecation occurs, steam or smoke rises, and there is the smell of burning. 84 executions using the electric chair have been considered botched since its creation. Today, only 8 states continue to use it to execute prisoners at their request as an alternative to lethal injection, with just one state, South Carolina, still using the electric chair as its primary method of execution, though no one has been executed in the state since 2011. The last person strapped into Sing Sing Prison's Old Sparky was Eddie Mays, who was executed on August 15, 1963, after being convicted of first-degree murder and robbery. By 1916, all of New York's executions had been relocated exclusively to Sing Sing's death house. Over the next half-century, Old Sparky saw the deaths of more people than any other electric chair, 614 in all. Many of those deaths were quick and painless. A handful were horrific. All are now immortalized as relics of the past. After Eddie May's execution, legal disputes placed the state's death penalty law in limbo until it was finally abolished for good in 2004. The rooms that once housed the electric chairs that killed William Kemmler, Martha Place, and so many others are now empty. But the work of Alfred Southwick, Thomas Edison, Harold Brown, Edwin Davis, and dozens more who brought electricity into the execution chair lives on. And the ghosts of those who met their deaths at the hands of their lethal invention continue to haunt us with their stories today. We end with power of another kind as we delve into the history of female bodybuilding. We often think of the Victorian era as conservative and unadventurous, a woman's role being primarily within the home. But some set out to challenge these expectations, striding onto the stage in one-piece suits and tights in front of cheering crowds. These early women bodybuilders blazed a trail for others to follow, becoming celebrities admired for their physique as well as their daring feats of strength and bravery. Our first trailblazer came from the Welsh market town of Abergavenny, growing up in the shadow of its ruined castle and towering town hall. Kate Williams, who would later become better known by her stage name Volcana, possessed impressive physical strength and performed as a strong woman in the late 19th century with strongman William Roberts, known as Atlas. Together, they wowed audiences in the UK and overseas. Volcana lifting heavy weights and sometimes even people one-handed. She was also known for performing a stunt named the Tomb of Hercules, which involved supporting the weight of 2 horses and their riders on a platform laid on her torso. Volcana soon became well known in concert halls and theatres, but used her celebrity status to promote the importance of physical fitness to other women. In 1903, during a 24-week tour in Australia, they were described as weightlifters and exponents of muscular development. In 1910, Volcana was also called the founder of the modern school of physical culture for women. She stood at a fairly modest height, measuring 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 10 stone and 10 pounds. Reports stated that she was able to lift anything between 56 and 250 pounds in a slow press, one-handed lift, and she always maintained that she did not adhere to any special diet to preserve her powerful physique. In photographs, Vulcana gazes out at us, serene and formidable, in poses intentionally designed to emulate ancient Greek and Roman statues. She was regularly snapped, flexing her biceps in an array of costumes. For example, in one she appears swathed in a toga with a tangle of bracelets and a metallic headdress. Powerful images such as these cemented her public persona as mysterious and near mythological, but they also displayed her femininity, with one photograph emblazoned with the title Vulcana, the Muscular Beauty. One of the earliest proponents of women's bodybuilding and strength training, Vulcana went from a modest background in rural Wales to a career as a fitness educator and pioneer, performing feats of strength around the world. While she was heavy lifting and flexing under spotlights in Australia, another woman was causing a stir in the vaudeville theatres of the United States of America. Laverie Vallee, who went by the stage name Charmion, was a trapeze artist that rose to fame in the early 1900s for her impressive aerial routines. In one, she twirled and twisted on the trapeze while gradually removing her clothes. The act was not designed to be titillating or sensual, but was instead engineered to display her jaw-dropping physical strength and muscle control. A video of her performance was recorded by Thomas Edison in 1901 and still survives today. She begins the routine fully clothed in a long dark coat, hat and skirt, removing each item and throwing it towards two spectators watching from the balcony. Smiling and waving to Edison's camera, she demonstrates remarkable body strength and confidence. Like Vulcana, Charmion was photographed wearing dresses and one-piece suits, often with feathers and flowers in her hat or hair, while tightening her bulging biceps and back muscles. By 1905, she was already a highly regarded star in theatres, and a review in August of that year noted her wonderful muscular development and startling feats of strength. In 1909, Variety magazine billed her as the most perfectly developed woman in the world, and noted that she was able to even talk and joke with the audience while performing her breathtaking stunts. Audiences may have been enthralled by Vulcana and Charmion, but another strong woman was to hit the headlines in New Jersey. From 1888, Josephine Blatt performed under the stage name Minerva with her husband Charles Blatt. Among her achievements was securing the title Champion Strongwoman of the World in 1893 and lifting a 365-pound granite rock with one finger, using a metal ring attached to the boulder. Sponsored by the sensationalist newspaper, the Police Gazette, it's claimed she once lifted a platform with 18 men on in a hip and harness lift in 1895. The paper claimed the weight lifted was approximately 3,000 pounds or 1,361 kilos. By 1937, this claim had grown to 23 men and 3,564 pounds, over 1,600 kilos, according to an article in Strength and Health magazine. This earned Minerva a place in the Guinness Book of Records, the feat remaining until doubt began to creep in about its authenticity. Finding the truth makes a little more sense when you learn that Minerva was also an early proponent of professional wrestling. Indeed, she took on all comers, men and women, and even became the first woman in the US to win a wrestling championship. With her husband in tow, she toured the US, Europe, South America, and Mexico. And, like other strong women of the time, her husband assured reporters that she ate a normal diet to maintain her muscular frame, although she was especially partial to a dinner of lobster. Minerva retired in around 1911 and died in 1923. Our final strong woman hailed from Germany and was one of 16 siblings born to athletic bodybuilding parents. Katie Brumbach was hailed by the press as Europe's queen of strength, beauty and dexterity, and billed by the Barnum and Bailey Circus as the strongest woman that ever lived. Other stage names she used included the Great Sandvina and Lady Hercules. Katie's husband, Max Heyman, appeared with her in a routine where she lifted him up in the air by one hand, to the gasps of stunned onlookers. One review of 1911 described her as a towering woman with the muscles of Thor, who dandled her husband upon her upraised hands as if he were a nice little doll. Among promotional images of Katie, one shows her standing firmly on the ground while holding 3 men off the floor in her arms. Her appearance was often commented on, standing at 6 feet tall and weighing in around 200 pounds. In 1909, Physical Culture magazine dubbed her an extraordinarily powerful specimen of womanhood. Like Volcana, she also took on a serious role promoting women's health, advising them not to eat too much, especially sugary foods, and to avoid drinking coffee and smoking tobacco. Katie smoothed the way for sports and performing careers to be made more accessible to women, serving as vice president of the Circus Women's Equal Suffrage Club. Volcana, Charmion, Minerva, and the Great Sandvina were not the only women of the late Victorian and Edwardian periods who lifted and flexed on stage. There were others too who performed dangerous routines for enthusiastic and curious audiences around the world, adopting stage names evocative of ancient power, strength and beauty. They entertained but also educated the public on how to achieve optimum health and fitness for themselves. It was a time of significant change for women, and as they fought to be recognized for their physical strength, others in the US and Europe campaigned for power on a different type of stage. The suffrage movement was well underway, and women would soon secure the right to vote in the early 20th century. Although these strong women openly challenged perceptions of women in Victorian and Edwardian society, they were not considered a threat. Eagerly accepted and marvelled at by spectators, reviewers were thrilled and astounded by their power, strength and size. Reporters excitedly printed their diet and exercise tips, and photographers found creative ways to record and share their image. For one, her routine and moving image was one of the first to be recorded on the moving camera by Thomas Edison. Developed only a few years before, she twirled and spun on her trapeze in 1901. In many ways, these early bodybuilders and strong women changed the course of history. They showed that, like men, women could be strong, confident, and build muscle. Their celebrity status elevated the sport, inspiring other women to cast off their long skirts and take to weightlifting. Abby Pudgy Stockton, Joan Rhodes, and Ivy Russell were all famous bodybuilders and weight trainers in the later decades of the 1940s and 1950s. These women took the concept to another level, inspired by those who had gone before them. And if you're someone who spends a lot of time in the gym, or perhaps someone looking at starting an exercise regimen, maybe they can inspire you too. Thank you for watching. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.